Hello and welcome to the Creative Writing Podcast. The topic of this week's episode is fairies, and I'll define exactly what I mean by them in a little minute. I'm recording this on a bank holiday weekend in the UK where I live, and there's a heat wave happening, and it's a perfect day for going to a park, finding a tree to sit under with a notebook, and indulging the kind of childhood impulse to tell stories about fantastical creatures, in my opinion. If you are not a magical writer and you prefer thinking about humanity and contemporary societies and real issues, then there will be something in here for you as well. But if you fancy indulging yourself in the sunshine, in some long grass, in a lovely park near where you live, that's the vibe of today's episode. As always, you'll need a pen and paper, the notes up on your phone, maybe. This is a project that is all about helping you get words down on paper rather than giving you writing advice. The first few minutes will be a writing warm up, and then I'll talk a little bit about why I chose the topic and why it's interesting for writers, and then we'll get to a main writing session. As I do every week, when I invite you to write, I'll just speak about every 2 to 5 minutes, and the spaces in between are really an invitation for you to concentrate, get that words down on the page, and know that I'm monitoring the time and kind of helping you guide a piece so that, in 40 minutes' time, you'll be really warmed up, you'll be in the full flow of writing, you'll have lots of ideas, and hopefully you'll want to carry on from that. And of course, if anything at any point makes you want to press pause and just carry on with your writing without my intervention and my voice in your ear, then I very much see that as success. So perhaps you'll only get as far as the first prompt today. God, that would be amazing if that's all it took to get everybody going. So today we're going to talk about fairies, and we're going to talk about small, tiny creatures um, who have magic and intervene in our lives. The idea of the fairy extends far beyond this kind of understanding of what they are. But it's not possible to do the whole of that mythology and lore in one episode. So I am going to be following this one up as well, I'm sure, with other fairy based episodes. We'll definitely, for another day, leave the idea of the fairy godmother or the good witch. I feel like she's a figure in folk tales and stories that really deserves her own series of episodes. So yeah, today we're talking about small folk, little people, tiny magical creatures who follow their own rules. Let's jump into a warm up. And today I'm just going to begin your first sentence for you and let you carry on with it from there. And like I said, it's warm, the sun is out, the flowers are in bloom, and we are like indulging our sense of how fun it is to write about other creatures in interesting and fun situations. So, once upon a time, there was a fairy who could not. I'll say it again because we're just kicking off. Once upon a time, there was a fairy who could not, and you can carry on from there. And if your warm up needs some focus or some guidance, then I suggest that your fairy might try and use magic to solve whatever it is they cannot do. You can introduce some magic straight away. And if you're enjoying your warm up, then do ignore me. But if you need some focus, then I think your fairy character could ask for some help. And if something joyful is happening on the page and you want the time to explore that a little bit more, um, and your your skills and your imagination were all very close to the surface when we began, then do hit pause now and you can carry on for as long as you like. But if you're coming with me into the rest of the session, then we're going to find a place to stop, pause. Perhaps there are some ideas just behind our eyes that we haven't quite managed to get down on paper. So we can stick those down with keywords and bullet points, sketch them out. A notebook full of ideas is a writer's friend. Perhaps we might just find somewhere a bit intentional to finish. The end of a conversation, a complete description. the completion of a train of thought that your main character is having, or a decision on what they might do next. That might make it very easy to pick up if we ever come back to this. And once we've found that end point, we can have a think a little bit more widely about the notion of fairies and small folk. So, part of the purpose of that warm up, that very, very broad idea where that you could take anywhere, was kind of to bring to the surface in your mind what you think you know about fairies, your instinctive expectations of a magical creature that a lot of us will have encountered in literature, particularly when we were children, and our expectations about a fairy story. And perhaps your instinct was that you knew some of the tropes and cliches and expectations around a fairy story and immediately chose to subvert those expectations for your reader. That's, of course, absolutely fine. It still demonstrates to you that you knew what those expectations would be. Um, Small folk and little people, tiny creatures, kind of full of magic, very otherworldly, really do populate the mythology and folk tales of Northern Irish, sorry, Northern Europe. They are incredibly British, Irish, Scottish, Scandinavian, and that's the storytelling tradition that I grew up on. So, of course, I'm going to instinctively reference it in today's session. But there are similar stories of sprites and goblins and elves and uh, tiny, small magical creatures that intervene in human affairs. That is quite a common, I think, story across the world. In the tradition I'm thinking of, fairies will sometimes get involved in human affairs. However, they live otherworldly lives and they often have their own world to return to. They're known for throwing a lot of parties. There's lots of singing and dancing, especially in the middle of the night. And they are magical, but they don't have magic that they can wield and that can be borrowed or learned. So they don't necessarily have spells that humans can learn or spell books. The way they use words and objects for magical ends is very innate to their being. And there's often a sense that the rules of magic that they are following are completely unknowable. They are so different from humans that we can't really comprehend their decisions and the rules that they're bound by. In, Often in fairy stories, humans stumble into the world of the fairies rather than attempting to get there. And in fact, attempting to meet them can be seen as being very dangerous. And parents in fairy stories are often warning children to kind of stay away from the magical elements of the world. Fairies don't like to be found out. They don't like to be observed by humans, even if they're sometimes fascinated by us. And often, when they are benevolent towards humans, it's for their own ends. Um, and today, we're really thinking about fairies who might do things that are quite well intentioned, but can end up causing havoc for the humans around them. And one example, I think that crops up again and again, is the idea that they might steal a baby because they think it looks very cute, spirit it off to fairyland, for 100 years, and then return it, not understanding that they've wrenched it from the heart of its family. And that idea that that things happen in life that we can't explain, I think begins to take us out of the magical realm of the literal fairy and into how they act as kind of metaphors and warnings and advice about the nature of the world. I think for those of you, I would have said at the beginning in the description, if you're not a magical writer, then what I'm offering you today is the opportunity to lean into the kind of the idea that we fundamentally cannot understand the nature of the universe, and that even if we understand human societies, there are forces at play which we absolutely cannot control or influence, and that do not prize us as individuals. An earthquake doesn't understand us in exactly the same way the Queen of the Fairies doesn't understand us, in my opinion. I think when it comes to fairy stories as well, we are sometimes invited into this idea that the world they live in um, is really different, and there can be um, a lot of the fairy stories play with time, the idea that time runs differently, the idea that night and day might be something very different, or a lifespan, um, and the priorities of that lifespan might be very, very different. So we're leaning into lots and lots of stories about small, tiny fairies who have their own agenda. At which point I realised that in stroking the cat, I had flipped the pages of my notebook. Um, so yeah, the idea that the normal rules of uh, human interaction, the normal expectations, emotions, politeness, bargaining, they're all suspended. So let's set this piece of writing anywhere you like. Um, it might be close to where you live, so that the setting is very instinctive for you, and you can draw on observations you've made. It might be in a world you've been working on. I know people love world building and the creation of fantasy places. And if nothing is jumping out at you, then we can go to the most traditional setting for a fairy story, which is the woods, whatever that means to you, whether that's a sort of a beech wood of southern England or a pine forest of Scandinavia. You can draw on your own experiences to create your own woods. Um, we're going to have a human character, and as always, you can choose a character who you have been working on and use this as a writing exercise to put them through their paces, or you can invent someone entirely new. And if it's someone entirely new, then you'll just need a name and an age. And we'll discover the rest of their characteristics and their personality through writing about them. So, um, in the story or in the piece of writing that we're going to write, your character is going to encounter a magical creature, a fairy world. If you are more of a sort of contemporary writer, then just indulge this and see it, and what you're going to excavate it from the end is kind of metaphor, psychology, the idea of stepping outside the normal. Let's begin with your character in this place. And in a moment, they're going to find something. But um, before we get to that, we're just going to establish for your reader and for you a sense of location. So I'm going to give you just 2 minutes. Your person might be walking through this place to get somewhere, or they might be static, having a lovely sit down. But we're just going to begin with a character in a place. And fairly quickly, in this place of your imagination, your main character is going to find a tiny musical instrument. Perhaps they immediately think that it might be something left by fairies. Perhaps they imagine it's an exquisitely made toy, an antique model, an item of doll's house furniture. You're going to find a very complete musical instrument, and we'll lean into them, finding it, exploring it, the physicality of that object, so very descriptive. So our readers have a real sense of what it is and its size compared to our human character. And if it hasn't already, let's make sure that we can hear the sound of the musical instrument that you've discovered. Perhaps that was your um, character's first instinct. But if we haven't got there yet, I'm going to make this tiny musical instrument make a sound. And now the sound is going to make something happen, something unexpected. And perhaps if your character isn't thinking about magic and fairies, they don't draw a connection between the sound of the tiny musical instrument and the unexpected thing happening. Or perhaps your character is going to realize immediately, wow, there's something more to this object than I at first thought. Or I've had my deepest desires or fears confirmed. This is something very special. I knew it would be as soon as I saw it. And now, on top of this magical object, the thing it has inspired to happen, I'm going to invite you to add a sense that something fundamental has begun to shift. Perhaps it's your human character's sense of gravity and the normal rules of the physical world. Perhaps it's time. Maybe it's the weather shifting in a way that can really seriously affect us. It's a sudden, major shift in the weather that humans would be very, very affected by. I'm thinking pressure, temperature, wind. Something in this world has fundamentally changed since your character found this object, made this sound. And I'm aware that the prompts I've given you so far are all about pulling a human character into a magical world very kind of gradually. There haven't been any fairies yet. Maybe your mind immediately put them in there. Maybe your piece of writing is already populated with fairies. But if not, and you want fairies, now I think is the time for your human character to begin to encounter them, see them. Whether they talk to them or not is up to you, whether they're scared of them or intrigued or enchanted. And of course, if you're thinking of this more as metaphor, then you might not want to include any actual tiny magical creatures at all. But if you love a fairy and you're thinking, where are the fairies in this? Then here they are. And now for the final prompt of this session. I'd like you to read back over what you've written. Have a look at the fairies and objects currently frolicking about on your page, and allow one of them to inspire your character to want something. So, if there's food or drink on your page, perhaps your character suddenly feels extremely hungry or thirsty. If there's dancing, perhaps they want to join the dance. If they can see a whole host of fairies, perhaps they're inspired to try and capture one. If the fairies have all these incredible, rich objects around them, perhaps they want to steal something. Or perhaps your character is seized with the desire to return the musical instrument that they found at the beginning. So that's what we're focusing on in the last couple of minutes of our writing today. Your character, having been introduced to this place, this idea that something has fundamentally shifted, this concept of fairies, one of their objects, now really wants something. And if you're finishing the session today with me and you've had a look at the time allowed, then we'll begin to draw things to a close. If you're really enjoying these ideas, or there's something in here that you want to continue with right now, then press pause and we'll come back to the end whenever you like. But if you're finishing with me, we'll begin to find a deliberate place to end. And as always, that might mean scribbling down our ideas, capturing what we've awoken in our minds that our fingers did not have time to get down onto the page. And some people might be exhausted and have written lots, and that's as much as they can do. And I'm sure other people are using the last 20 seconds to speed up as much as they can. I've run a lot of workshops at this stage, and those are the kind of two reactions to being told it's nearly done. So that was about half an hour's writing session, beginning to develop the idea of a human character who finds an object, stumbles into a world that they don't understand, and begins to meet the magical creatures that we call fairies. If you want to investigate objects a little further, then and you didn't do last week's episode, then we were actually looking at treasured objects and talismans last week, so that might be quite an interesting follow-up. I'd invite you now to read back over what you've written and in today's session, it might be interesting to think about the elements that you were instinctively drawn to from this topic that has a very large shared understanding among people in our society who love stories. We all have an instinctive image in our mind of the fairy, whether that's drawn from, popular culture like Tinkerbell, or the stories we were told as children where fairies might be a little bit more magical and dangerous, and less of a Marilyn Monroe waistline. Perhaps it's the mystery that attracted you. Perhaps your fairies are automatically quite dangerous and dark. I think I'm going to follow up this session with one next week on the idea of, bad, mysterious, tricky fairies. Perhaps for you, it was the elements in a human character that is drawn to the curious, the mysterious, the unexpected. Perhaps it was the personality of the musical instrument that you began this with. If you're on a platform where you can leave comments, I'd be incredibly intrigued to know what musical instruments people chose. So do leave me a comment if you're listening somewhere that you can. In my mind, it was a harp. I'll tell you that now. But I appreciate that there are as many versions of that as there are instruments. Maybe your fairies were electric guitar fairies. I think it's a perfectly reasonable choice. Whenever we do a piece of writing, it can be interesting just to reflect on what we would want to expand. Sometimes, especially when you're following somebody else's guidance, as I encourage you to in these sessions, your mind can act in a very tangential, creative way. So the idea that you may want to pick up and run with from this piece of writing may have nothing to do with magic or fairies. The chaos of our creative souls is something we really want to lean into, and it's the most exciting part of developing a writing practice, is learning how to pick up the threads that interest us, follow them to the end, not be too prescriptive about what we're going to discover about ourselves and our creative work every time we sit down to write. So maybe all that happened today was, you discovered a location, and it's a normal everyday location that you've never written about before. You've created a place and you're going to follow up with different things that happen in that place. Of course, it's all entirely valid. And then, as we always do, when you're reading back, make sure to highlight or circle or star anything that where you think you nailed it. There will be something, there should be something in every piece of writing where you think, oh, that's a nice description. That jumps off the page for me as a reader when I'm reading it back, or that's a nice transition from my character being very interior to a description of things that are happening outside them. That's a nice piece of dialogue. And if you are ever looking for a writing prompt, then your notebook becomes a set of writing prompts where you can lift phrases and ideas from your previous writing and drop it into the next session of writing that you want to do. So I hope you enjoyed that kind of slightly indulgent fantasy session on the idea of the fairy. I've got small folk in the piece I'm writing at the moment, and I don't know why today felt like the day to focus on them in this in the podcast. Partly I think it's the idea of high days and holidays and the sun shining and the leaves on the trees being out and the grass being long, and the idea of, balmy summer nights when you can hear music on the wind and you don't know where it's coming from, and it could be anything, and there's no reason to expect it not to be slightly magical in nature. I hope you have a lovely week. If you want to carry on, then remember there's plenty of episodes now. You can have a scroll back through and choose another one that appeals to you. And I hope to see you next time when our fairies will be darker and more malevolent.